Hey guys, this is Mikro. I'm back with another video on terms of meta, in terms of like what's being played. This meta, it has evolved a bit, but on NA this is like basically just driven from supple and dropouts. There's no other company that seems to impact what can be played in terms of, for most people, like you could play any spec you really want to that kind of makes sense and it will work. Like there are a lot of specs on this list that I tried that were kind of more weird, and they worked versus every other company except for supple. So now all of this is just kind of based off that mirror matchup and off of watching EU. But from my understanding with EU, there's only like two good companies there as well, or two like dominant companies, so they have their own meta that's driven off the top too. But NA is very very similar. So the main thing on this list that's kind of different, like they run different like gear specs. Like they always prio Brazil freedom shrinking for it versus NA at times will prio like what do you call it, refreshing, but it's like dependent on specific builds. So EU's kind of different in that aspect. But yeah, in terms of what is really good, the hatchet is kind of making everything change because it's just by far the best support weapon right now for every class, which is weird when they come back to here and you see it not on A tier for healers, but that's just because IG does a little bit more specifically for healers in niche matchups. Um, but or in most matchups. But in terms of like why Hatchet is so good, so I'm running like a little bit of a different Hatchet tree because I have Keen Speed. So I'm running like Aim Throw to get to this third perk or the third crit, and when I hit my guaranteed crit, then I'll get speed off of that, so I could use that like to consistently get speed, which is how I navigate being in medium, which I'll go into in a second. But yeah, you hit two things, or if you get a crit, then you get your haste, and then, or if you hit a headshot, you also get your haste. So, but inherently, this has like low crit, so it's like very easy to use this as an escape at times. It's not that hard to hit a headshot on like a healer that is just kind of standing still. As well as the other big thing is this, like the social distancing throw. So if I have the weapon perk on it and I get it off, then the cooldown is only like 7 or 8 seconds, like without any refreshing. And then it gives me so much distance to get away. So it's like very easy to live with the hatchet as a solo weapon, and it's better than rapier at the moment in terms of living. And that's not even including like berserk, which will give me an extra 20% haste or something like that. So you're like near a haste cap at that point. It's very very solid. But going back to the list, like the main thing that's like changed. So this greatsword hatchet, this is just like the best space holding build in the game at the moment, besides like maybe BBs. A lot of this meta is like a little bit newer because the game slows down when you slot more and more BBs, because your kill squad can't actually dive the back one because they get pressured out by BBs. So then it's like a weird spot where the kill squad needs the ball to make space for them to dive. So then at that point, like a light kill squad doesn't make a lot of sense because they have the chance of getting like one tapped, and if you're having the chance of getting one tapped because you're in light, then it makes sense just to go medium, right? And you go medium, and that's not a problem anymore, which is why there's been more and more of a movement for greatsword hatchet players to go to medium. And you don't have as much like survivability in like OPR or something like that, but you're able to hold space better. And if you have something like my hatchet that I have on this account with keen speed and refreshing distance throw, then I'm like able to very easily like live most situations. Even in medium, I'm able to outkite people. So yeah, it's like the base of like why that build is very very good. If you watch EU VODs, you'll see them all the time. I really recommend Plage. He's very solid at it. But IGBB and Light, this is like a niche build that's going to come around because a lot of healers are heavily dex warded in NA. So IGBB is able to just two-tap healers because healers are heavily dex warded and are not warded to fire as much, because the only fire thing that's meta somewhat is BB. So it's just a way to exploit that, and a way to two-tap healers is with Light versus in medium. So it's just kind of a funny thing, and Light's also able to like kind of go into space more. But this build does like easily lose to bow, and it does easily lose to BBs, so you have to be like kind of careful with that. And it also can lose to medium greatswords if they're positioned correctly. So it's like you have to be a little bit careful, but at times it's like definitely the most consistent healer killing build in the game. And next thing I have on here is bow hatchet. I think it's solid still. It's able to, well, more than solid. The hatchet gives it like insane survivability, and the bow is like the best individual pressure thing in the game, I'd say. Like, which is why healers have been heavily warded against bow. But in terms of like pressuring clumps or doing anything more than that, it's not very good. But in like a 1v1 situation, which happens a lot with Kill Squad, Bow Hatchet tends to do very, very well, and it's very easily to live and kite out because you have Hatchet, and it's very easy to get kills because you have Bow, so it makes a lot of sense. A Greatsword Hatchet and Light I have on there as well. I think it's solid. You have to it's like you have to dive with it though, and it's like it's dependent basically on the enemy team's like peel squad, if you will. Like a lot of companies don't even run a peel squad, and this build is like insane if there's no one that's peeling. But if there's someone that's peeling, it's like a lot less good, and you see that very, very quickly that it gets a lot less good the more people are peeling. So the more BBs they run, the worse this build will be. So that's kind of the situation with that, but it's still a very solid build. I just find it to be a little bit better than medium. And also, if you see someone in this build and you just shoot them at all, they just like instantly die because they have a extra rend on them from being in an onslaught stance. So, yeah, you have to be really, really careful when you actually go for and commit for things. And if you're playing against this build, you just wait for them to commit for something, and then you shoot them once, and they'll just be dead. And if they're not going in for things, then they're just AFK, and at that point, they're just worse than every other build in the game, which is why you don't see light as much, but it's still a solid choice. Greatsword Great Axe kind of suffers from the same problem where you have to run this in light, because if you don't run it in light, you don't have a gap closer, and if you run it in light, then it's like it can be awkward because you have to clear space first to do well. But if there's room to operate, this build is insane, and it's probably better than Greatsword Hatchet. It's just this is Greatsword Hatchet's a little bit more survivable, so you're more easily able to like commit your life and not be afraid of like getting out. But these both have insane escape abilities and are both solid choices. Musket Bow, kind of enough said, not including exploit. Still, it's solid. SNS Hatchet's like a support kill squad build that has been a little popular, where it's like sort of like you just try to take people's stam away so other people in your group can get the kills, and you just give them leadership. So it's not like it's like kind of the opener, if you will. Like you try to bait the attention on yourself, and then the rest of your team gets value off of that. Really only good as a one of in every group, and I don't think there should be more than 1 to 2 in a kill squad, but it's a good choice. And other things on here are a little bit less competitive, but still good. BBVG, I've seen it a little bit more. In light, a little bit in medium too, but mostly in light, as just like a one-shot combo thing. But if you read people's animations right, you don't really need to run a VG ever. You could just get away with IG, and at that point, you're more survivable. And then most of these other builds are better in like OPR and 3v3, but a little bit worse in war, basically. Musket Rapier is like annoying at times, but it's not as good as Musket Bow usually. And then, because you're not usually in a spot where you need to be escaping if you're positioned correctly. Uh, Fire stuff, IG still needs buffs. Void Blade still needs buffs. Your Rapier is a little bit sleeper, but it's not good versus BBs and not very good versus bows because you have kind of longer animations, which are kind of weird and are a little harder to hit. But if you know how to hit them, they're in longer animations, so it's not that hard to deal with. In terms of bruisers, nothing really here has changed at all. Stone form is still best. The only thing that has changed a little bit is the kind of stone form people use. People tend to use the one that explodes versus the one that's extra fortify at the moment. So that way you can get your main combo off, which you don't need more than 3 seconds anyway, because it reduces the time of it, and then you have a little bit of burst at the end. So it's like a good balance point between Detonate and the really tanky version of Stone Form. Detonate in the Bruisers is solid. A lot of this stuff has changed a little bit too because everyone is basically running Stone Form at the moment. So if everyone's running Stone Form, then things like Vines don't make as much sense because the best thing a Vine can do is force a Cleanse Pot or a Stone Form or Relentless Freedom or whatever escape ability they have. So which makes it so that other ults like Bile have a chance to kind of come into the play, and then they fix some of the bugs with Bile from my understanding, so it's like a little bit better than it used to be. Slash actually runnable. And it's like particularly good with like IG BBs as Bile. But just due to how fast I can build ults. But that's the state with those builds. Other builds on this list aren't super mentionable. You're usually just running these. Greatsword Warhammer, like you can run it, but it's like just not as good. BB Warhammer is not really a bruiser build, it's more of a support build at the moment, but that's on the rise as well. So I'll just jump into the support stuff. IGVG is still king of support. There's not much of a debate to it. You can stack like 11, effective 11 refreshing if you go 50 focus. I know if you don't want to go the refreshing route, people in EU tend to run 300 plus int, and then they run 200 con and just forget about the CDR. But NA is like the opposite, where it's like, hey, you can get to 11 like 11 refreshing effectively with 50 focus, and then people have been trying to do that, and then just basically going infinite on abilities, and then you use that to be more survivable, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's how IGVG's being played. It's there's no debate. It's just the best support build in the game, just because of the way how much util all the VG perks have. IGBB is still solid as a support option. Really good at countering people that have lots of kill squad members. You just have to be careful and like read your animations to when you use your abilities. You don't want to lift your abilities with this, and you don't want to dump your abilities into clumps either. You want to use them for people on your back line most of the time, except for like maybe nades. Nades you can kind of dump a little bit more into like clumps that your bruisers are fighting, so it's not pad, but it's actually pressure. If that makes sense. BB Warhammer is newer. I think it's better in medium than light. If you run it in light, it's more of a kill squad setup, and it's not bad. But it's like very like one-dimensional. In medium, you can kind of play for the BB more, and you don't really have to worry about the secondary. It's like, and then when people are actually in a spot where they can get hit by the Warhammer and they manage to stam themselves, then you can kind of go for a one-shot combo. So it's like a pseudo kill squad build that works very well as a support, and it seems to be solid. It's been run a little bit more on NA, and I've seen some people trying it out in EU, so it's kind of on the rise as well. BBVG, the only bad part about this is people run a ton of freedom, so you can't do most of the combos with it. But you can do Warhammer into BB combos. You just can't do Warhammer into Warhammer combos, if that makes sense. BBVG is solid, but it lacks in survivability. But if you can configure around it, it's a solid build. IGVG with Pile-On gets ult charge a little bit faster, but is less good than these other builds, and these other ones on this list don't make as much sense. Hatchet is very good with BB, but you don't really want it if you're playing a support build, because you usually want to be able to step on point, and Hatchet isn't as good at living on point as like an IG, and doesn't provide as much util on point as an IG. Going on to tanks, IGBB with Pylon still the best one by far. Gets ult charge super fast. You see like 4 to 5 of these every war. That's just solid. You could use that ult now to like dump into bio. I think is a little bit more than dumping vines. Don't go stone form with this because you're already super tanky. You don't really need it, but you'll get ult charge. Like you'll get ult every 30 seconds to 45 seconds. So bile and vines make a lot of sense. A detonate, yeah, I wouldn't go detonate. Do bile or vines with this build. SNS Fiji, a bit sleeper in NA. This seems very solid. I have not really seen it in EU. The whole idea behind this is just like kind of passive fortify that can't be stripped super easily. So I need to test this defensive formation. This account doesn't have this like leveled up, but another character does. But basically, this 30% isn't really removable from bruisers. I was told it gets stripped by Oblivion. You have to re-put on your shield, but with the way that you should be playing this, you don't really have to worry about that. Actually, I'll just log into the character that has that and like show the setup for that, and I'll come back to it in a second. But this is solid, and I'll kind of come back to that once this character loads. But yeah, Great Axe Warhammer doesn't seem like it would be solid in a tank group, but with Stoneform, it's completely viable and does a lot of things better than all these other builds, which is just kind of funny. But yeah, that's kind of just how that happened. Kind of an accident, and people realized it was pretty good, and now it's being seen more and more. VG BB. Oh, it's also a good counter to BBs because BBs don't like being swung on, and this just swings on BBs and is tanky enough to live the damage. VG BB, very solid versus group meta. If it's more spread out, it gets a bit worse, but if people are super stacked, it's very solid. Spear Great Sword's like a newer thing that's kind of come around that seems interesting, but I wouldn't say it's like as good as the other builds. Like could maybe like BB and these two builds are like very close in terms of util provided, I guess. The spear idea is like this is a 30% rend. You run enfeebling on your spear, you got 45% weaken, and then you either take the sweep package, which would be like a you if you build it right, you can do like plague strikes on top of people basically. That's effective from a lot of the half heavy attacks and from the sweep attack with the final like coup de grace. So then you could put that on them. You could also do a cyclone package on that, and then you have insane survivability. Both are very solid. It's just not as popular as these other builds. So which is why I put it a little bit lower in terms of the meta. IGBB without pylon's still solid, you just don't build ult as fast, so it doesn't really make sense to me. Like, the actual pylon burst works off the dot gem too, and it gives more ult charge than it should for the actual burst itself. Like, the way it's coded, it's a little weird. So you can just literally drop it on point and you get more ult charge than this build every single time. You can also drop it on pylon or drop it on dummies at the start of war. Not a lot to hate about pylon right now. Yeah, and Great Sword Warhammer is still okay, but it doesn't seem as solid anymore. It's like if you try to do too much with it, you do nothing and you just lose. It's sort of like in a spot where VG or where Voidblade was, where it's like it's better in small scale than big scale, and in small scale it's solid, but then in big scale it's like SNS VG tends to be better. So let me show off like so I've been messing around with Greatsword on the SNS, but the idea behind SNS also being good is you can do Plague Strike to Trenchant Rend, and then if you do this and you switch weapons and you have no inherent cooldown on it, so you can just kind of spam it. So that's like a way to get around the whole Oblivion thing, where it's like, oh, if people drop an Oblivion, then you don't have the SNS, but it's also like, okay, people drop an Oblivion, I go for a heavy attack, I switch off and then switch back to my weapon, and I hold my shield again, and it literally doesn't matter. So, or you could just like literally tap your other weapon and put your shield back up immediately. You just have to keep track of the Oblivions with it. But VG solid util, can't really blame it. It's like, and then the SNS basically makes it so bruisers have 50% passive for it if they have the normal bruiser tree, and then they run 10-10 split. So that's just really, really hard to kill in most circumstances. But yeah, that tech is literally just this. So do a heavy attack. This will it doesn't even show it, but that has both debuffs on it, and you switch off and you switch back, and then it has both debuffs on it. You can kind of go back and forth. So yeah, that's the idea behind that. But it's very, very good, very slept on build. Didn't seem as insane for a while, but then when you have VG, if you know the pressure's coming, you could just drop the Obliv early and then block, and then you'll gen the stamina that you need back. It's also a little bit better if you play near your VGs or VGs play near you, and then you play on top of your bruisers. So if you deathball, this build is very solid. It's hard to see the util unless you look at VODs, though, but when you look at VODs, you realize how annoying it is at times. Healing-wise, Ice Gauntlet, I think, is on top. This is weird. So versus light stuff, Ice Gauntlet just completely destroys lights because it traps them in and makes them use more stam, and then they can't dodge as far. Like if you land a shower, so it effectively you easily trade 1-for-1. Usually you trade positive with any light kill squad player, like a great sword. So it's like a counter to that. And then the other thing is if the meta slows down, then usually you run pylon with this. So then your pylon just gets more value, and you just do things with your ult, or you'll be able to get your ult faster, and then your ult helps you live more. So not a lot to hate about it. Hatchet's good for the reasons I said earlier. It's like if you have single target pressure on you and you're more split, I'd say Hatchet's generally better. But if you're more grouped with your ball, then Ice Gauntlet tends to be better. Rapier, I think, is outclassed at this point. I still stand by that, but I know some healers still run Rapier and are able to live fine with it. I just think the other options have more util and have better survivability, so it doesn't really make sense to run Rapier anymore, if that makes sense. Like Hatchet, you have that 30% disease that you could kind of throw whenever on a clump, so then you're like pseudo support at that point. Ice Gauntlet, you literally can trade positive for people versus just running away, so it's like I don't see a lot of reason to run a Rapier anymore. A greatsword is good for the first 5 seconds that you use it, and then after the first 5 seconds, like once you lose the haste, it kind of just falls off a lot. But it's not bad as a choice. And then Void Gauntlet, if you see anyone with the Void Gauntlet, you just run at them. Yeah, and then they usually die unless they're like really, really good at the game. And then ults, I kind of talked about this earlier, but Stoneform is being meta has changed some of the ult things on this list. So if you assume that everyone's running Stoneform and you're like the one person that's not, Bile tends to be good because Bile can put something on them that you won't see but as much, but it can force people to use the Stoneform, and if they use the Stoneform, it doesn't do much versus the Bile, if that makes sense, because they still can't receive as much healing, and people that like soft counters Stoneform in general. Vines is decent because it could force people to use stone form, but you can't really use it as like an all-in to confirm kills at this point. So at that point, you want like a fortifying vines or some kind of vines that's sort of a bait for them to use CDR because it's not going to be resulting in kills. So you're just trying to force more ability or force more ults per ult that you have, but then also vines misses a lot, so it seems generally worse than stone form. Detonate can force stone forms. The problem with detonate is that you're just inherently weaker and people tend to shoot you now if you have detonate going on, so you just have to be worried about like more careful about that. So in general, I would go stone form. There's a few builds on this list like IGBB. I think Bio is very solid. IGVG, I think there's an argument for vines and there's an argument for stone form. There's also a weird argument for detonate if you're going to EU spec and you are going above a 300 int, because that perk will also make it so your detonate does more. So it's like the best damage scaling detonate build in the game is IGVG, which is kind of weird. Just because it works off of your passives. So if I had a VG, which I have, but it's not on, then like this 15% affects that detonate damage, and then this 30% affects that detonate damage. So you're able to scale very, very well on top of that. You look at the int perks, and you get to like 150 int, that's more damage. You get to 300 int, that's more damage. So it makes sense for some builds to run detonate, which is a little bit weird. But yeah, that's basically everything from my rankings. It's just like generally go stone form and then run something at the top of this list and you'll be fine. Like Greatsword Hatchet, I don't think is like as meta in NA, but people that have tried it in NA tend to stick with it. So it's like one of those things that like once you try it, you realize how nice it is at times, and then it's like kind of hard to go back. So yeah, that's what I've got for this video. And then also some of the stuff is dependent too. So if you're versus people that don't run BBs, then you can go light in kill squad. You can get away with it like very, very easily, and or like don't run bows that like harass people in kill squad. But if people are doing that, then all those light builds like significantly fall off very, very hard, and then medium makes a lot more sense. So yeah, that's what I have though for in terms of tier lists. I tried to talk a little bit about like what breaks stuff more in the game, but it's basically if stuff is like if these builds are able to do more than they normally would be able to, like a Great Axe Warhammer Stoneform's able to go in very hard, commit with their full combo, and like not worry about having to die. So that's why that's really good. Great Sword Hatchet, insane survivability, insane DPS. You don't really lose DPS by going medium because if you slot the gems, you just get it back, and then that kind of negates the consequence of being an onslaught stance. So that's why it makes more sense in medium on paper. And then this is like GBB is just relatively good. Like this could be an A tier. It's kind of a borderline. It's just based off of like what healers are running and then how they tend to be thrust protected. This tends to do very well because a lot of it is fire damage, and you scale off fire damage very well. So you're able to like one tap people with this build, which is without any like combo necessary. So it's like weirdly good, but doesn't seem that way all the time. Uh, IGVG I've already talked about, IGBB I've already talked about, Ice Gauntlet I've already talked about. So yeah, and then Stoneform has literally made the meta. So that's why those are all relatively broken. These other builds are just tend to be better that are in S tier, and then A and below is like they're good, but they're not played very often because they aren't as good as their competition. So yep, that's all I got though. Let me know what you guys think if there's stuff that's been different on your server, but this is what I've seen mostly being played.